chill out for a minute. In the meantime, maybe Vivian, did you have? Do you want to do you want to ask a question now? We have time to fill, so.
Hey everyone. Yesterday we were doing the questions and I did not really ask my question, I guess. So I was wondering, my mom has periodic paralysis and my twin brother does too. And sometimes I have this, how do you say that? I feel, just when I'm walking around or doing anything, I kind of feel so tired, but not like I'm going to sleep tired, but I don't know, it's like your body decides to go to sleep or something, I don't know. And I was like wondering if that is a part of the periodic paralysis or not, because when I talk to my mom, she's like, could be. And and when I talk to my boyfriend, he's like, you're working too much. So yeah, I'm not really sure, and now we're in a room full of people who might have experience with that. So I was like, maybe if someone recognizes it, we can talk later on to, just talk.
Well, has this been your whole life?
It's like a couple of years, I guess now, but I never really thought about it.
Well, do you respond to potassium if you get paralyzed?
I don't know, we never really tried. And my mom was like, can you move? So I tried like jumping around and everything. So that goes well, but I still feel, it feels like nothing really helps. It's just like, it's kind of, you're getting a bit dizzy and everything is so kind of heavy or something. I don't know. So I was like, maybe someone knows anything, or
has anyone felt similar stuff? I'm because I think we're quite different in terms of mutations.
Yeah, I know.
Definitely there are times
so
when
that's why I want to throw it in the group.
there are times when I wake up in the morning and I'll be like more tired than I should be tired, and then I suck down the potassium and I'm like, oh, okay. And it wasn't just frank paralysis, so meaning that the attack manifests not just as paralysis, as we said before, like there's all kinds of different ways the attack of paralysis can happen. But hold on.
Hi, I think that maybe it is connected, I don't know, but do you feel that just things are effortful, that things that shouldn't be effortful are more effortful for you?
Yeah, it's just I cannot really think straight, and
I think the thinking straight is probably something to do with it. That seems to be quite common.
Yeah, because sometimes I have it when I'm working, and then it's like I just cannot really do my work.
Yeah,
as
when
I'm
that
supposed
happened
to.
to me when I was working, I would take my potassium or drink some coffee and then. Or
Yeah, because
both.
I'm trying to. I think the
And
only
then
thing that really helps is getting outside in the cold. Because yesterday we talked about how everyone is feeling better when they're getting warmer, but my mom and I always experience the cold as a good thing. So I think that's kind of the only thing that really helps. But I talked to Janine about it yesterday, and she was like, is it a walking, or is it going outside? Or, there are lots of different variations in that. So
I think it's really hard to pick it all apart.
I know.
And it's all just like a murky big pond of, life. But if you think that it's effortful, or if it feels like walking through treacle, and everyone else is, full of beans, then maybe that is something to do with your condition.
yeah, okay, thank you.
Oh, wait, hang on. Sorry.
Sorry, there are days I get up and I feel I'm in a fog, and I can't think straight. And I've often wondered, is that part of it as well?
Yeah, I don't. It's. I think it's not especially in the moving, but it's like in my head, and my body is deciding. Okay, we're shutting down or something.
Yeah,
it feels like
I
that.
would feel similar now. There are days. I would feel similar. Other days.
And
I'm
what do you
great.
do about it then?
I just work through it.
Okay.
There's nothing I do in particular.
Okay. Try potassium. Okay, I'll do that.
One of the things when you're doing diagnostic software is that you have to distinguish carefully among various terms. And one of the interesting things is almost every language that I've asked about seems to use the word tired
I
to
know, that's why I
describe
was like,
two
it's-
separate
it's-
things.
Yeah, I
One
know.
is sleepiness, and one is a feeling of malaise and not feeling like you can move your muscles much. And it's striking that so many languages use the same word for two things which are really somewhat different concepts, although sometimes they can happen together. And as people have mentioned, there's this third concept of what people have referred to as brain fog, that is another thing. And so part of the difficulty in expressing this to people is that there are three separate concepts that are hard to explain to others.
Yeah, because when I talk to my boyfriend, I'm like, I feel tired, and then he's like, yeah, but you're working and everything, and blah blah. And then, but it's like not tired, but tired. I don't know how to tell it in another way. Yeah, but not in my. It's like I can move. Yeah, I think it. Yeah, in my thoughts, I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering, because I don't know, because of my mom. She has it, and my twin brother. So.
I get fully paralyzed and my daughter does not.
Yeah. Okay.
In the same family, that they're going to be different. There was a woman here yesterday had 3 kids with hyper. All of them have different severities of the disease.
Yeah.
Very different. So you could be like your mom. You can be like your mom, but not react the same. I mean, react the same, but to a smaller degree.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
So you don't have to, you might never become like her. This is just my personal opinion. You may never have everything that she has, but you have enough that you need some help with. I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So thank you, and we'll talk.
You want to do, for example, if I feel an attack coming, I can't do two things at a time. I can't listen to what he says, and I can't listen to music. So then I can start getting a little bit depressed, and then I think, what is going on? And then you have an attack, and then you say, okay, that was it. And the next time, you recognize it a little bit better, but then it's always the tiredness, not doing two things at a time, and that's the beginning for me for an attack.
Okay. Okay. So, if anybody wants to talk about it later, I'm here.
Great.
And thank you.
Okay, so there's a fourth concept, hangover. But I was trying to sort all that out this morning. Okay, are we ready?
Hi everyone. I am so sorry I can't be there in Dublin with you this year. I miss all of you very, very much. As most of you know, it was with deep sorrow that we learned of the passing of Dr. Frank Lehman Horn in May. Frank had struggled with a series of cancers for the past few years, forcing him to give up his lab. He had done so much for the periodic paralysis patients. He pioneered genetic testing, offering it to many of us, and discovered mutations, validating our diagnosis and allowing us to optimize our therapy. He coached many of us in our treatments. He pioneered diagnostic methods like sodium MRI and new treatments like Inspra. He published prolifically, literally writing textbook chapters on periodic paralysis and related disorders. He mentored generations of researchers and clinicians. Most importantly, he was a loving and kind and strong supporter of the Periodic Paralysis Association and of the patients suffering from these diseases. He will never be replaced and never be forgotten and always be missed. Frank, his family and mine became very close after he found our mutation in 2006. We traveled many times to Germany. Frank and his wife Krista were marvelous hosts as they showed us the beauty of many European countries. In turn, He and Krista spent many happy hours with us in Florida as we explored the USA and the Caribbean. He became so much more than my doctor. He was one of my dearest friends. We laughed, we cried, we shared his entire struggle with cancer. He never complained, he endured unending treatments, and he was always optimistic. In fact, it became a word we used often to talk about life. He would never let me not be optimistic, and eventually he added tenaciously optimistic to my description as we fought for patients all over the world. Today I want to express what his thoughts were about all of you. He never gave up looking for mutations and new treatments. You were never a number on a tube of blood. Every sample in his lab was a person and part of his family. You all had giant bound folders behind his desk, and he would pull them out and study them as the samples were tested. He wanted as much detail as possible from all of you, and I am sure I was sometimes too tenacious for many of you as I asked you for deeply personal information. It was all to help Frank try to identify these mutations, which were hidden like needles in a haystack. It was not uncommon for him to be in the lab before 6 in the morning and not come home until very late at night. He moved with the speed of lightning. He didn't know what slow down meant. He knew he had a limited amount of time to accomplish so much. The most meaningful award Frank received in his lifetime was the Art of Listening Award. He valued that night in Washington more than his many professional awards because it was from the patients he loved. The video of him receiving the award can be found on our Periodic Paralysis Association website. Frank was the most amazing person I have ever known. He gave us so much and only stopped shortly before he passed away. His kind and humble nature will never be forgotten, and the PPA lost a friend of great magnitude. I lost a mentor and someone that I loved. Please enjoy this conference in Dublin, make new friends, and share information. Frank taught us well, and we will continue to try to fill a small portion of his never-ending presence for all of you.
Wow, okay, that was heavy. Steve, you have also his
So I wanted to take this opportunity to acknowledge some of Frank's contributions. I had the good fortune of having met him way back in 1992. So he had come to the United States for a scientific conference. We had just published our very first paper on periodic paralysis, and he stopped by in Boston, and we met. And although we were, in some regards, scientific competitors, we were always friends, and he was always so kind and helpful in teaching us new techniques and sharing ideas and information. And we invited each other back and forth to symposia and things like that. So we also shared background. Frank had a master's degree in mechanical engineering. I started out with a master's degree in mechanical engineering. And then he went and trained as a clinical neurologist at the Technical University in Munich. He was a member of their outpatient clinic where he worked with Reinhard Rudel and others and really pioneered the study of several muscle diseases, not only periodic paralysis, but also malignant hyperthermia. It's a problem, anesthetic-related, uncontrolled metabolic activity of muscle. But as you heard from Linda, he had boundless energy. And so he made a lot of his first observations while he still had a high clinical load down in Munich. And this is his very first paper in 1981, published in Muscle and Nerve. And so this was paramyotonia congenita, and I highlighted in yellow. He made the first initial observation way before genetic testing by doing classic studies with electrodes and measuring electrical properties of these muscle biopsies from patients, that there was something wrong with the sodium current. And he recognized that way back in 1981. And it was really because of this observation that 10 years later, about 9 years later, when the scientific techniques of genetic screening and hunting for mutations was available, it was still impossible to screen everything because the human genome was just so huge. So you needed a hint of where to look in the haystack, and this was the hint. It was Frank's information. And just 2 years later, he publishes another paper, this time hyperkalemic periodic paralysis, which is also called adynamia episodica hereditaria. You can understand why that name kind of went by the wayside. But again, interestingly, he found a sodium channel problem. It's really landmark that he made these observations because in both of these conditions, as you know, there's myotonia as well as periodic paralysis. And at the time, all the physician scientists and physiologists were thinking about the chloride conductance because the myotonic story of the goats from the 1970s was sort of the way everybody was thinking, and Frank changed all of that. And then just 1 year later, working with Reinhard Rudel, he showed that in hypo-PP, where people thought, you know, the attacks come in low potassium, if things were acting the way they're supposed to, your muscles should have gotten supercharged and the batteries got too negative and perhaps they couldn't be excited. And he said, nope, that's not what happens. They have the paradoxical depolarization. So in 3 years, he made the fundamental observations that are really the foundation of understanding how hyperkalemic periodic paralysis, paramyotonic congenita, and hypo-PP operate. And I love to show this. This is, you know, a data slide from one of their papers and highlighted that's you depolarize instead of hyperpolarizing. But what I want to point out and what's great, so Frank's in the clinic all day, they get this biopsy. These are tough experiments because the biopsy sample is viable for about 12 hours and that's it. And you know how rare this condition is and how infrequent it is that a biopsy might be available. So they're working and working at noon, 2 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night. So most of us put elapsed time on the axis. Frank always liked to put the time of the day so you could understand, how his experiments were growing. And so again, he was a wonderful guy, great sense of humor. After making these seminal observations, he kind of wanted to go to the Mecca for neuromuscular research, which was the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. So in the late 80s, he goes there, and it's a long way to come from Munich. Travel, probably trying to drive all the way up from Chicago. It was Sunday. It's kind of conservative there in Minnesota. So he goes to the store, and it's like, there's beer. But it was root beer. So he was really surprised when he picked up root beer at the grocery store. But nevertheless, he had a great time in Minnesota. And then when he came back, he then had the opportunity to become the director of applied physiology at the University of Ulm. So Reinhard brought him from Munich up to Ulm. And there was a great celebration with this event. There's a center in the Netherlands, the Neuromuscular Center, that sponsors conferences several times a year. And it's always in Naarden in the Netherlands. But for this special occasion, it was moved to Ulm. And several of us, Louis Potacek was there, I was there, Al George, all these names you heard of people who found the initial mutations. This was just 1 year after the first mutations were found. So that was a great event. And as a result of that meeting, one of these papers was published about, whether it's a new mutation or it runs in families. That's the point of this. But he and others at this meeting coined the term channelopathy. So a disease, apathy relating to channels. You can see he's one of the authors there. And this was the very first paper in '93. And then if you go on the professional PubMed list and just say, show me all the papers that have the word channelopathy in the title, you can see how that expanded. And of course, there are many, many additional publications dealing with ion channel disease because not everybody uses the word channelopathy. But you can see how it grew, and he was part of this right from the beginning. You heard about some of his awards and accomplishments. Another one was that in 2008, he was honored with an endowed professorship from the Hertie Foundation, and there was a big celebration in Ulm. Again, lots of people came. Here's Frank and Reinhard Rudel clicking some champagne. And just a couple of days before, he had a birthday party at his house. It was his 60th birthday. Was just a terrific time. So I want to join Linda in saying, there will never be another Frank Lehman Horn, and he did so much for all of us. So.
So this is a nice segue. We have the older generation and now the newer generation. So who's speaking first? Is it Esther or Bass? Esther's first? I got to call up the... she has an extensive curriculum vitae that I have to pull up here. So Esther Merkes is a medical student in the final year of her general medical training at Radboud University in Nijmegen, in the Netherlands. As part of her education, she's now working at various departments of neurology in Nijmegen. In 2016, she successfully investigated the variability of the long exercise EMG test in patients with periodic paralysis as part of a research internship under the supervision of none other than Bas Dunnenberg and Professor Baziel van Engelen. With her unique knowledge of periodic paralysis as both a patient and a budding physician, she is now poised to contribute to the clinical care of patients with periodic paralysis. After finishing her medical education in January, she's considering pursuing a career in neurology or public health, but we know she's going to go into neurology, right? So, come on up.
Thank you. So, thank you so much for having me. As I was already introduced, I'm Esther Merkes. And I am not only a medical student, but also a patient. And I did some research for periodic paralysis, so I think I decided to tell you something about all of these three things today, because I don't think there are that many doctors who are both a patient and a doctor and also a researcher. So I am from Nijmegen, which is in the Netherlands but not Amsterdam. It's close to the German border. And I wanted to tell you something about my life as a patient. And it's, for me, my science started when I was a little child. As you can see on this picture, I think it's pretty obvious. On the left side, I had some problems with my eyes. I don't know exactly what it was, but it was hard for me to keep them open. And on the right picture, I was feeling just fine. So I think that's the only material we have which I can show you from my time as a child. But I can remember playing on the ground, and my parents had to sometimes pick me up from the ground because I wouldn't be able to get up myself, or I would fall down to the ground again after being picked up. So it started, we don't know exactly when, but I think when I was around 3, 4, or 5 years old, something like that. And growing up, there was some trouble sometimes, especially as I played tennis. Each week I would play tennis and afterwards I would be paralyzed. So I did like playing tennis, and I was able to play a normal game or just train. But afterwards, when I would go home and sit on the couch, every week I would be paralyzed. And sometimes I had to play 2 games in a day, and that was quite horrific, because after the first game I would sit down, and then in the second game I would hardly be able to put my arm up above my head. So playing tennis would be very difficult. And also making tests in school is something I remember very well, because every time I would have to make a test, I would have trouble getting up afterwards, and I would see where the nearest toilet was and try to hide because I was ashamed. And in normal lessons I wouldn't really experience this, but every time I had a test, I was paralyzed afterwards, or weak at least. As a child, we knew it wasn't totally normal, but we never really thought I might have a disease. I went to a doctor once, but he thought, well, I don't really know, and maybe you should get out of puberty first, and then we'll see again what might be wrong. But my life went on, and I decided to go to medical school because I really wanted to help people out, and that drove me to become a doctor. And in medical school, I realized that it is not normal to have the episodic weakness. And I was also getting quite afraid because as a doctor, you have to be able to help other people out. And I wasn't sure if I would be able to do that all the time. So that's when I decided to go back to see a doctor. And that's when the doctor sent me to a neurologist. And the neurologist didn't really think I had periodic paralysis at first, even though before I went to the doctor I read something about periodic paralysis, and because when reading it I was so certain, well, this must be it. I know this is what I have. So I told the doctor, I think I have hyperkalemic periodic paralysis, but the doctor didn't think so. So it was still a long run before I got my diagnosis. There were some blood tests done. There was an EMG test. I think on the next slide you can see the needle EMG showed some myotonic discharge. So that was a sign that there was definitely something wrong with my muscles. They also did a muscle biopsy which showed some vascular myopathy, so which was also a sign that there was probably something wrong. And in the end, genetic tests were done. This is also a picture of my EMG test. It's the long exercise test, which I will be coming back to because my research is about the long exercise test, but it was also explained, I think, yesterday. So in the long exercise test, it is shown that in the first 5 minutes, oh, you can't see it. In the first 5 minutes of exercise, my come-up went up, my CMAP, so my action potential over my muscle became higher, but after a longer time of rest, it was shown that my muscle got weak. So this also helped me get my diagnosis. And there is also a little video.
En weer terug. Blijf even staan en kun je misschien met wat steun proberen een tijdje zo te staan.
Yeah. So this was at one of my appointments, actually, when the genetic tests came back. So we already knew that they found a mutation in my sodium channel, but I also experienced some weakness during that appointment. So we also decided to test my potassium right away during the weakness and afterwards. So my potassium was up to 5 during the weakness, and in just 1 hour it went back to 3.9. So that was extra proof that I am suffering from hyperkalemic periodic paralysis. And well, I think it was nice for the doctors that I was at the appointment week that time, because at the previous appointments I was feeling fine. But of course it was so stressful to get the results from the genetic testing that I wasn't really surprised I was weak. Okay, so after being diagnosed, I found it to be quite a hard time. I was referred to several specialists, including the clinical geneticist, because I am the first in my family who has these symptoms. So we discussed whether we should test my parents or my family, but we decided not to, because the chances of them having periodic paralysis and having no signs at all are very small. So, well, we discussed that at the clinical geneticist office. I was also sent to a cardiologist, which I don't really understand, because I don't think there's a big chance of me having a heart problem as a hyperkalemic periodic paralysis patient. And luckily everything was fine, so that's good. I also saw a dietitian because it's easy to say, well, try and minimize your potassium intake, but it's not so easy to do it. So I got a little help from the dietitian in knowing what I should eat or how I should do it. And well, I think it is helpful to have a specialist talk to you about it. I was also seeing a physiotherapist for quite a long time because of the exercise as a big trigger for me, especially the rest after exercise. So I was in an extensive program where I learned how to exercise without being paralyzed afterwards. Having been paralyzed every time after exercise as a child, I kind of hated exercising. It was a very negative experience for me, so it was not so easy to get a positive vibe around exercising. But I think I'm doing much better now. I'm trying to work out without any peak load on my muscles, and I'm keeping my heart rate below 145 beats a minute. And for me that works out, so I'm now doing regular exercise without getting paralyzed afterwards. And I also saw a psychologist, which was very important for me. I think being diagnosed with a chronic illness at any age, but especially at a young age, is quite difficult. And I think everyone should be able to get some help with that. Luckily, I have some treatment which is helping me out right now. I take Diamox twice a day, 500 milligrams. I also take magnesium. I'm not sure why it's helping me as a hyper patient, but it takes away most of the pain I was experiencing. Sometimes I had pain in my muscles for days after I'd been weak, and the magnesium helps with that. And during an attack, I try to take in sugar, so for example, dextro energy, which helps me make sure I don't get into full paralysis. I tried identifying my own triggers, and most of them are pretty common for hyperkalemic periodic paralysis. So as I already told you, rest after exercise is a big one for me. Stress really makes a difference. Not having breakfast soon enough, so being in a fasting state is a big one for me too. I've noticed that being tired makes it easier to get weak. Of course, potassium-rich foods. And for me, a big one is sitting still for a long time. So in the morning, if I have a meeting, I always try to keep moving or go to the toilet after half an hour, or make sure that I don't have to sit still for a long time, because that's usually when I get weak in the morning. So as I already told you, right now I'm trying to exercise regularly, but without any peak load. I boil all my vegetables to keep the potassium as low as I can. And I try to keep moving. So if you want to get up, go ahead. What is scary for me is how the future might look. Of course, this is an autosomal dominant disease, so there's a big chance of passing periodic paralysis on to the next generation. I think that's quite scary, especially as we see that everyone can be affected differently. Even if you have the same mutation, we see that people are very differently affected, so that's pretty scary. And I'm also not sure what my attack rate will be like in the future, or if I will have permanent weakness, or if I will be able to be a doctor in the long run. So I think that's pretty scary. I also wanted to tell you something about how I see periodic paralysis as a medical student, because I think sometimes it's different than just being a patient. I know that it can be very, very frustrating to find the right diagnosis, and I know I was quite lucky to get my diagnosis within a year. But it can be so frustrating for both patient and doctors to keep searching and not finding the right diagnosis. And I think that even if you don't have a diagnosis, it's very important to realize that you are the only one who knows your own body. The doctor doesn't experience what you experience on a daily basis, and it's pretty difficult for a doctor to tell what your triggers might be, even if you have a diagnosis. So it's really important for you to identify your own triggers. It might help to keep a diary to identify triggers. I found this quite difficult as a patient because I thought, what should I keep in my diary? There's so many things which might influence my strength. But for example, try to keep a diary about your diet for a month. And then if you see a pattern there, you can learn from it. And then the next month you focus on exercise, or the next month you focus on something else. Because I found it quite difficult to keep track of everything, because then all your life is about periodic paralysis, and I really didn't want it to be about that. But in the end, you are the one who can identify your own triggers. And also try to make sure you get the help you need. So even if you are not diagnosed, you might need help from different specialists other than a neurologist or a general practitioner, and make sure you get that help. For example, a psychologist. I started seeing a psychologist even before I was diagnosed, and it really benefited me, because having a chronic illness, even if it's not diagnosed, is so difficult. If you need help, make sure you get it, and don't be ashamed for needing help. And what I also wanted to say is that the main goal of a doctor is helping other people out. Sometimes it might not seem that way, but every single one who's doing med school with me wants to become a doctor to help other people out. So try and team up with your doctor. Don't start a fight or get caught up in an argument. Try to work together, and if something is very important for you, explain why it is important. Because if the doctor understands why something is important, I think all the doctor wants to do is help you and make sure you get the help you need. In this respect, I also wanted to say it is very difficult when a doctor says conversion disorder might be a diagnosis you would have, and I think it is very wrong to diagnose someone with it if it's not true. But conversion disorder is something which can be treated, and I think it is also not right if a doctor never thinks about conversion disorder, because people who do suffer from conversion disorder should be treated. So I think it's only wise that a doctor considers it. So don't hate your doctor for thinking about it, because if it would be conversion disorder, you might be able to get treated. So moving on to my research internship. It was only 3 months, so it was quite a small research project. But I tried to look at the reproducibility of the lung exercise test, the test we already talked about yesterday. So in the lung exercise test, I will explain again. You have to move your little finger outwards for 5 minutes as a exercise to make sure that in the resting phase after the exercise, your muscle might get weak, and the amount of decrease of your muscle strength is what is measured, and we call that the CMAP. It's the action potential over the whole muscle.
So there's no needles there, it's just a sticker?
Right, there's no needles needed. Yeah, it's all on the surface. And yeah, that's true. Yeah, the blue block is giving you signals, but it's, well, you can feel it, and some people say it might be a little painful, but I don't think it's really scary or something you shouldn't do because of the pain, but that's my personal opinion. The lung exercise test is already written about quite a lot in literature. For example, Fournier wrote about it, and he said that the lung exercise test might be that good that it could even help identify the mutation underlying the periodic paralysis, because they wrote about different patterns you can see in the weakness after the exercise in different mutations. So that's quite interesting. But we thought that even though the lung exercise test might be really good, no one ever really tried doing it multiple times in the same patient. So we're not sure if the result we see is really the result which belongs to a certain patient, or is just coincidental for that day. And that's what we wanted to look at. So we had 5 patients involved in the research, and they all had the lung exercise test performed 4 times in total. So we tried to keep all the everything the same, the same people doing the test at the same place, and we thought, well, let's see if we get exactly the same result each time.
Were you one of the patients?
I was, yeah. So I was one of the patients, and there were 4 other people. And as an outcome measure, there's kind of a cutoff line at 40% decline in CMAP. So if the muscle gets, well, it's not easy to say it gets weak for 40%, but it's kind of the measure we use. And if it's more than 40% decline, then we say it's a positive test. So these were the 5 people who participated. Unfortunately, most of them were using medication, which we thought might influence the results of the lung exercise test. But, well, it's not easy to say to people, well, just stop taking your medication because we want to do this trial. So,
Patient 1, right?
yes, I was. So these are my results. We did the lung exercise test 4 times. So on day 1 we tested both the left and the right hand, and on day 2 we also tested both the left and the right hand. And as you can see, my tests all ended positive, so they were all showing that I have periodic paralysis. And each time the result, the maximum decrement was around 60%, so I still had 40% of the CMAP left, but it was a decrease of 60%. So we did make a graph of like this for all 5 patients, and if you combine those, we found this, which unfortunately shows that there's quite a range in results. So even though my results were pretty close together, patient 3, for example, had a really big range and had 2 positive tests and 2 negative tests. And patient 2, 4, and 5 all had all negative tests, even though they are genetically proven patients. So patient 2 and 5 were on medication, so that might be the reason why they tested negative. And patient 4 tested negative also 4 times, but she didn't have many attacks, so that might be the reason why, but we don't know for sure. And if you look at the range of these results, it's a mean of almost 30%. So the range, when doing it 4 times, is almost 30%. Interestingly enough, 3 of the patients also had a lung exercise test before they started using Diamox. And we thought, well, let's look at those results. And as you can see, before the red dots are before they were using acetazolamide. And as you can see, the higher you get, the more decrement you have. So the weaker you get. And without medication, they all had a bigger decrement than on medication. Of course, this is a small group, and there might be some day-to-day variability, but it's very probable that the acetazolamide did influence the results. So to conclude, we think that the results of the lung exercise test can range quite a bit when performed multiple times. So we found a range of 29.5% when doing it 4 times in these 5 patients. And that is pretty significant. But we also found that 4 out of 5 patients tested had the same result each time. So only one of the patients had a different result when retesting. So we think that when the result of the lung exercise test is negative, there's not a big chance that when you retest, you will get a positive result. And we also think that acetazolamide affects the results of the lung exercise test. So if you want to use it as a diagnostic instrument, people should not be using any treatment. So that was it for me, I think.
Oh, Esther, you should be really proud of yourself. That was like just a super presentation from all aspects. So I have 3 questions. First, since I have the mic, I can do that. Can the compound muscle action potential be an indicator of treatment success? Like, do you guys think? I don't, feel free also. Like, but I feel like if acetazolamide makes you better, then you should have a negative CMAP, which would be great. And if you are taking medicine and you still have a positive CMAP, it's an indicator that you probably could do better. I mean, and then might that be an indication to switch to something like dichlorphenamide? What do you think about?
Well, I think it could be an indicator that treatment is working or is not working well enough. But the main reason to do this research was to see if it's really a good indicator of the amount of weakness you get. And we saw that the variability is quite high. So if you just do the lung exercise test and you see that there's less decrement of CMAP, but it's only a small difference, that can mean treatment is not working well, but it can also mean that the test is not, it's just not picking it up, or the variability is too high.
Well, I think that's a great study, and we often underestimate as physicians the variability of our test results, because if you do the same in, let's say, an EEG, we are used to repeat EEG once, 2 or 3 times in order to see a graph element. And I think I've learned in medical school, if I have a positive result, positive in the sense of a abnormal result, that provides evidence for my diagnosis. But a negative test result does not provide any evidence. It does not provide evidence that I'm wrong. It just does not add new information. Yeah.
But I mean, do you think that in terms of establishing whether someone is sufficiently treated, I mean, because that would kind of change how periodic paralysis is managed on a day-to-day or a month-to-month basis. If you can objectively measure that you are substandardly treated because your CMAP remains positive, and when you're properly treated, the CMAP goes negative. But I don't know if that's something we can look into.
So let me say that I'm very proud of Esther's presentation, of course. So she did a great job, and she was quite humble, saying that our department was still doing okay, getting diagnosed in 1 year. Because when someone comes in and says, I've got my diagnosis, and at first someone else said, well, I'm not sure because you don't have flaccid attack, so probably it's not periodic paralysis, let's do muscle biopsy. But she already diagnosed herself, so we must be humble as a department as well. But it still took 1 year if someone comes in with the right diagnosis. So that's just one comment on the side. And the whole goal was because we also want to have a individual treatment outcome measurement. And so we wanted to see whether if we would switch you to another treatment, if we had some evidence of performing long exercise test on couple of days during this switch in treatment, for example, or an N-of-1 trial. So I think if you look at the results, there is this variability, so maybe you should do not just one test at a certain time point, but you should do at least both arms. So you have some sense of variability. It is quite a long test of 60 minutes, but you can do both arms together if you're a bit trained probably as a lab, so that would be a nice step. And of course with the bumetanide, what Steve was talking about yesterday, the group from London are trying something different. They're trying to see if you can escape this decline in CMAP. So you provoke the attack and then see to a certain point where it declines, and then try to rescue the decline with a treatment at that time point. So then you're really using it as an in vivo treatment model. So that's really interesting, but also, again, if you have this variability that we see, we're trying to get the best in vivo model, of course, to do all the things that Steve is coming up with and try to get it to patients, but sometimes you need something in vivo in between. So it looks quite promising, but you need to take into account the variability.
So I also agree that was a terrific study. As you know, in the literature, they talk about the fact that although the sensitivity isn't as high as we would like it, in other words, there can be some patients who absolutely have periodic paralysis for whom on an individual day the test result is normal. On the other side, the initial reports, the McManus papers and so forth say the so-called false positives are essentially unheard of, where an individual without periodic paralysis would have this decline. I know that Dr. Griggs and Dr. Amato in Boston have said they've seen individuals where they thought they've seen a false positive. So I wonder if you've looked at that. It might be interesting to, because this is such a beautiful study. It's a very time-consuming test, and these data are hard to come by. You should study normal. You should get your mentor to do this test 5 times, I think, and he could be one of the normals.
I think in literature there is something written about testing normal people without any periodic paralysis, and I think even a Chinese study, which is quite big, tested like 70 patients, well, not patients, but people without periodic paralysis, and they found some people who even had a positive test result when retesting, and they couldn't really explain why, but it was just a few percent. So I think less than 10% had a positive result, which they couldn't explain really. But they did show it also in retesting. So it is possible that people who don't have periodic paralysis do show a decline in CMAP, and we don't really understand why. So yeah.
Just to finish on that point before asking a question, when we do diagnostic software, we very much have to struggle with these issues of where else is the test positive. And if in normal people you get a few percent, one might imagine in other neurological conditions one would even get a larger percent. And so getting that kind of information is going to be very important. But when you were showing your slides, you showed that one of the things you could do was some sort of snack called dextro something or other. And I wanted to point out that when one says sugar or recommends to somebody to have sugar, it can mean 2 very different things. One is glucose, which is also called dextrose because it's D-glucose. And the other is sucrose, which is a disaccharide of glucose plus fructose. And it seems that the fructose is the most damaging part to one's metabolism and liver and so forth. And I was wondering whether there's some effort to get people to use just dextrose, which one can, I know in the United States you can now buy this at Whole Food stores, that there's things labeled dextrose, and there's a bunch of reasons why not only the periodic paralysis community should be careful about avoiding sucrose, but particularly for people with hyper, for whom dextrose is for whom sugar of various sorts containing glucose is a rescue, that one should be very careful about large amounts that also contain fructose, and it might be good to recommend to people to try just with the dextrose, meaning glucose, which may be a better strategy.
That's interesting. Thank you. I've never heard about it.
Hi. I'm curious. You were talking about how tests are hard sometimes, or it used to be. Like you sit down and do the test and not be able to stand up. And that must have played a part, like with brain fog and things, and cause possibly to do worse on tests. And I feel like that might happen to me and maybe other people in here too, is maybe adrenaline plays a part and all these things. So now that you know, is there anything you do? I mean, in medical school, I'm sure there are big tests that are kind of scary, and even presentations, like beta blockers or something that can, you know, try to do proactive to prevent that?
That's a good question. First, I would like to say that I don't really understand why stress is such a big trigger for me, as I'm hyper. So I don't really understand, but it's very, very typical. I always was weak after tests, so it must be something. And right now, what I try focusing on when doing a test is to keep moving. So even though I have to sit still, I make sure I have enough room, and I'm wiggling a bit on my seat, which is quite annoying because I should be focusing on the test. But well, that's part of living with periodic paralysis, I guess. I don't really use any medication for it, and I never really considered it.
Yeah, with hyper, you wouldn't really need to because the adrenaline isn't something that.
Yeah, I'm not sure what part of it is the problem, but I do know that after starting Diamox, I got much better. So before every time I would sit down for a long time, so even if I would see a movie or would go through the theater, I would have a silly walk afterwards. So it was very typical, but right now I usually can get up without too much trouble. So it's much better on the Diamox.
Cool, thanks. Do hypers get brain fog too, or is that just a hypo thing? Hyper, yes? Okay, just...
I'd two things to say. One to Gabe about the exam thing. My son's just done, in the UK we have GCSEs at 16, they sit all their subjects all at once. So he's hypo, and he had some special arrangement whereby he was in a separate room from everyone else, so he could wiggle as much as he wanted. He could get up and walk around. He had a different chair from everyone else because they were sat on like collapsible picnic chairs, which is no use for him, and they had to sit for like good 2 hours each time, which is much longer than they do in class. He could have used a laptop if he had wanted to, because it's a lot of prolonged writing, or a scribe, but only if he had used that on a regular basis in the school. And he had extra time because after a while his writing just like goes like slower and more spidery. And all of that was pre-arranged with the exam board before he started, so that might be a help. But I just wanted to ask you about your study, Esther. So I'm a doctor as well, and I was just wondering, you took a test that has been used routinely to look at periodic paralysis. We don't have many tests that are actual things that you can look at scientifically, and you basically seem to have blown it out of the water. In terms of variability, were you surprised that that happened? And having done that, obviously it was such a small study, have you spoken to a statistician about how many people you would need to do to show power in a scientific study to actually show that that was a problem?
Well, I was surprised how big the variability was, actually. I was really rooting for the test because for me it helped maybe even more than the genetic results in understanding that there is really nothing I can do when I'm weak. So the genetic test is nice and says, well, it's a channelopathy, and there you have your diagnosis. But doing this test, I really saw, okay, so even if I don't do anything, I get weak, and it's not my fault. So I really liked this test for that reason. But we did see that the variability was quite large, and I didn't speak to anyone about how many patients we would have to test. Because I think it would be hard to get that many people together and to take the time to do all those tests. No, I'm not sure how many people we would need, but I do think that the long exercise test can still be used as a diagnostic tool. But maybe it's just not that solid as we might had thought it was.
Oh, hang on.
Before you throw the test out the window, shouldn't you keep in mind that all 5 of them were on Diamox? So they were better, they were at better strength than they would be without medication. So,
Yes.
so maybe the test really showed that you can't use it when people are on medication because medication blurs the result.
Mm-hmm.
But you can still use it on people who are not on medication yet.
Yeah, it might be true, and it would be really interesting to do this research in patients only who are not treated. But I do think that the variability is not just a result of treatment, because the treatment was also quite stable. So I think it's not just the treatment, but it might very well influence the results. That's true, yes.
I'd like to make a comment on variability. We're hearing a lot about it. I mean, it's one of the key features of periodic paralysis. Just to say that I think there's very strong biology here. So we've heard, from parents and caregivers, this is not just my child doesn't want to go to school today. And interestingly, we see this in the mice. So every time we do an experiment, we do. Every time we do an experiment on the left calf and the right calf in completely separate baths, separate bottles, okay? There's no connection. And every animal has its quirky responses. So there's a funny oscillation, or it's a very profound attack or a mild attack. And the 2 muscles from the left and the right leg are always exactly the same. Although from mouse to mouse, it's highly variable. So there's a huge biology. This is not random chance. We don't understand it. I think it's a terrific opportunity to understand the fluctuations you are all experiencing. And we see this under conditions where we can absolutely control the potassium. It's in the bath. So potassium levels are important. You all want potassium monitors. But there are other things that are going on that's causing the variability, and we're trying to explore that biology, but it's a very real, robust thing.
And I think, by the way, the opportunity to study this, these conferences, we don't leverage it enough. I mean, you have like 50 to 100 people who come with periodic paralysis, many genetically identified, some not, so like, let's plan something for Florida. I don't know.
Just to say it's a wonderful presentation, particularly in your second language, and you'll be a wonderful doctor. And I've got 2 comments. One is there a gene linkage between wanting to study medicine and having periodic paralysis? Because statistically in here, this is getting ridiculous. There's at least 4 of us who are patient doctors. I know already from this room of 2 who are parent doctors, and we have 1 almost doctor and 1 who's either going to marry a bicycle or he's going to be a doctor. Anyway, I wonder if you can get this variability issue out into the open and published fairly widely, because I had a CMAP and I'm gene negative. So I've already been weaponized as being, no, you haven't got it, it's a conversion disorder. And my CMAP was 28%, minus 28%, which the doctor who did it said, yeah, that's absolutely compatible with hypokalemic paralysis that goes with the Anderson-Towell, my cardiologist already said I had. But then that was shortly afterwards, there was a publication that said the cutoff is 40%. So immediately I was sort of weaponized again. So I sort of, and I cannot be alone in this. So, I mean, there are patients who constantly don't quite make the grade, but who have absolutely barn door clinical story and, response to potassium. So I would just like to ask you to get this variability issue out there very rapidly. Because I think it would help a lot of us who've had 1 test that wasn't normal, but it wasn't abnormal enough, and it delayed my treatment for at least 9 months.
Thank you. We'll work on it.
I have a comment that's related to really both aspects of that, the previous question. In the neurology department at Children's Hospital in Boston, we had about 20 faculty members, and 2 of the faculty members had kids diagnosed with strokes after they were already faculty members. I think the reason was that we were just better at noticing something that would have been dismissed in one case as Bell's palsy, in other cases I'm not really sure. But I think part of it is that some of these things may be really more common than is generally appreciated. And as people with medical interests were better able to say, no, it's not just this really common thing. It is something unusual, and there may be cases where people have a milder case or something. It's just we're the ones who will persist and say it really is this, and really demonstrate that to the point where we can convince our colleagues. And on the subject of conversion disorder, I believe there are real instances in which something is a conversion disorder, but my guess is it applies the other way. I have this fantasy of going through Freud's book on hysteria and coming up with clues that some of the cases were actually periodic paralysis. I've read through partway and gone through one of the cases, and I didn't see any sort of clear signs, but if anybody else reads through that book and finds things, I'd love to publish a paper together of sort of pushing in the other direction and saying, anytime you think of conversion disorder, ask yourself if it's periodic paralysis.
I have a question more relating to your first part of the presentation. I don't know if you're comfortable to share, but what when you saw the psychologist, what are the kinds of issues and strategies that they addressed, and how did they help? Were there specific problems that you asked about, or did they just kind of guide you? Because I know that there's a lot of folks here, especially the younger generation, and their parents would want to encourage maybe speaking to someone, because it's hard to deal with this.
I don't think it was a very special treatment. It was kind of just working through the fact that you are diagnosed with a chronic illness, and by that losing part of your future perspective of being a normal grown-up, and having to accept that there will be challenges in the future. I think that was the biggest part. It was just an acceptance problem. Not really a problem, because I think it's sometimes still difficult to accept that we are just different from other people. But I think the phase just after being diagnosed, and it was a difficult time, and it was just good to have someone to talk to who helped me understand that it was normal, that it was a difficult time, and that I should take all the time I need to be sad.
Okay, great. Yeah, okay. So I just
Sorry, just on the thoughts about variability, it's probably a bit simplistic, but were the tests carried out at the same time of day, or was there variability there? Because I'm just thinking of people have eaten or not eaten or fasting, or would that affect the results?
Mm-hmm.
And just as a follow-up, maybe just the previous presentation about Dr. Lehman Horn, he always had the time of day. Maybe you could learn from that a little, But just about the variability, had they eaten before or after? Or?
Well, we tried keeping all the circumstances the same, but it didn't work out in all the patients. So some patients were there on the first day in the afternoon and in the morning on the second day. But we did test both arms at the same, just after one another. And in all patients, we started the first test with the left hand and then the right, and then the next time we did the right first and then the left, just to see if that would make any difference. But we didn't really make sure they were all at the same time, or people would eat everything exactly the same each time. Also because in normal day, you can't really control that. So if people are coming in, they will be different each time. And I think we just wanted to see in a normal day practice, what kind of variability would you see?
Okay, so there's we're gonna have one more comment, and then there's some snacks outside, and I want to give time for Bass to do his thing.
I just wanted to touch on seeing like a psychologist while you're going through this chronic illness. It's just hard on like your family and yourself. So you talk about things like feeling guilty about, you know, messing up your family's day, or you know, they just give you coping skills. It's important to be with a psychologist that specializes in chronic illness and chronic pain. That might take you 3, 4, 5 counselors to go through to find one that you mesh with. But I think it's very, very important, and maybe even having all family counseling to, you know, touch on that and be able to learn how to speak with doctors so you don't get into the fights. So they give you communication skills, what to focus on in that area too. So I think that's very...
I saw a special neurologist, psychologist, so she was specialized in people with neurologic disorders, so that was really good. And I also came with my boyfriend a couple of times because it was also affecting him quite a lot, and I felt it would be good to work on it together, and it really helped a lot to go there together.
Awesome. Okay, guys, I apologize that there's more questions and stuff, but I think we should take 5 minutes, just a little snacks, maybe a diuretic break, and then come back. All right, everybody. All right. In the interest of time, I am going to start to introduce Dr. Stunnenberg. Maybe in like 30 seconds or a minute from now. Just take. Okay. Hi, everybody, again. So it's my sincere honor to introduce Dr. Bas Stunnenberg. Bas has been with us since 2011, he said? So he gave his first presentation to the PPA 2011 on arrhythmias and periodic paralysis. And he's been a faithful, fresh new blood in the organization. He's been very helpful with the PPA Ask the Experts, and is showing interest in research and continuing in the field. So that's just really exciting. He's done all his studying in the same university as Esther, Nijmegen in the Netherlands, in Radboud University. So he has a master in medical biology and then a master in medicine, so MD, from University of Utrecht. Then he did a neurology residency back in Radboud. And in the same year, he also started his work on his PhD thesis entitled, so he's just an overqualified neurologist. It's a PhD thesis entitled Personalized Treatment in Skeletal Muscle Channelopathies Using N-of-1 Trials, which, by the way, for rare diseases may well be the future of how these things are going to be studied. Both his residency and PhD will be completed soon in 2019, and then he's going to do a 2-year neuromuscular fellowship. He serves as the medical advisor of the Dutch Muscle Society and as an ad hoc reviewer for a number of professional scientific journals, including Muscle and Nerve and Neuromuscular Disorders. His clinic work and scientific work focuses on the diagnosis and treatment of pediatric and adult patients with neurologic channelopathies, including migraine, epilepsy, myotonia, and periodic paralysis. So, Bas, it's all yours.
Thank you. So thank you for the introduction, and I can't believe it's my third time already. I'm 33 now, so third time PPA. It's quite a nice accomplishment. So thank you for providing opportunity to come to Dublin and previously to Orlando all the way. So I want to do a couple of things this morning, and it's not all very strict. We can skip maybe parts if I see a lot of people falling asleep. I might just go to the next slide. But I want to tell something about N-of-1 trials and how it can be a new way to investigate, or actually it's an old way that we should renew for rare diseases. I brought some slides with the diagnostic criteria that were recently published in this review by Stetland and all. So that's also afterwards in between the slides, so we can quickly look at that because we had the discussion on it on Friday. And I brought a video of a patient during an hypo-PP attack at the emergency room, because I think it's also quite rare to have a video of someone really being in a flaccid paralysis attack. So it would be nice to, we have it published, so it's great to have it for the scientific community, but it's also nice, I guess, to look at it together. So I want to start with this classical picture painting from 1887, and It's showing Jean-Martin Charcot. So he's a famous French neurologist. He's actually at the base of probably most neurological disorders that we still study. And it's such an important painting, and also interesting because you see all male physicians. So that's the first interesting observation, because now in the Netherlands 70% of students is female, so there's a big change already going on. But you see this one character, so Jean-Martin Charcot is here, and for the neurologists it's interesting because there are all other French famous neurologists there. So Joseph Babinski, we have this Babinski sign when you strike under the foot of a patient to see if there's a central problem. So he's holding the woman, and Jean-Martin Charcot is teaching the audience. So this is really experience-based, right? Every physician is looking at this standard figure, or the hierarchical figure who's telling about hysteria. So what was Michael telling about Freud and describing hysteria, I share the same opinion that probably here he is teaching for this time period. Well, this is a classical hysteria case with an arch shaped posturing during an attack, and they would say, well, this is typical hysteria. But of course, with the knowledge we have now, we don't know what she was having. So it's another interesting observation from this painting. And so this was the way to teach medicine for probably a century, and it brought us a lot of good observations and clinical notes. And then came the evidence-based medicine movement. So in 1990, from Canada, Sackett and Guyot, they founded, or at least they published, this new idea about how medicine should be like. So they said, this is a new approach in teaching medicine. That was the first idea. So really explicitly judicious, such a difficult word for me to pronounce, use of the best current evidence in making decisions about the care of individual patients. So they said you also need objective study measurements, you need some statistical power to scale the evidence of all these observations. And we should combine them with the expertise that you have as a doctor and the patient values and preference, and then come up with the ideal treatment on an individual basis. I think it has gone a bit, it has too much power these days because it became from evidence-based medicine and transitioned to evidence-based healthcare. So everything should now be evidence-based. So this new approach in teaching is now evolving into all these evidence-based guideline protocols, reviews, but also macroeconomic decisions. So for example, for new treatments to get registered, you need this top-level evidence of group parallel randomized controlled trials, and you can already imagine that for rare diseases it's quite difficult. So in the absence of effectiveness is not the same as ineffectiveness, right? You just should study it, but then again, it doesn't help to have this maybe gospel, because some call it a gospel or religion of evidence-based medicine. So it has certainly brought us a lot in the field, but it also has the downsides, especially I guess in rare diseases. So this is this pyramid of evidence that is central in evidence-based medicine, with animal research, in vitro research being more below, case reports, case series, and these systematically blinded randomized controlled trials at the top. And while this might work very well for homogeneous diseases such as maybe stroke, of course in a heterogeneous disease it's quite difficult to fully have confidence in this level of evidence. Because in rare diseases, we have small patient numbers, so it's already difficult to have these two groups of comparisons. And this heterogeneity is also causing the groups to be at baseline so totally different, so you're not really sure what you're measuring, and you can say, well, I take the patient from a group, I take one big group and I let them take the treatment and the placebo, but still you have a lot of methodological difficulties there. And how will you interpret such an outcome? So, for example, you have just one outcome on the group level, but what does that mean for you sitting in the room with the physician if you say, okay, so on an average of this big group of patients, I would expect this, but I'm not sure where you're at in this interval and range of this effect. And this leads, it's in Dutch, so you can practice if you like, but this leads to all these difficulties in coverage decisions. So we have all these expensive drugs, and probably this is one of the big challenges for the couple of years, to have all these new, very expensive drugs delivered and covered for the right patient. So who deserves the treatment? Does everyone deserve it, or some patients? And how can we make sure that we select patients that are really in need for the treatment, and maybe also select those that you don't want to give the treatment to, because they are also they come with quite side effects. Just as an example, I was talking about it yesterday, and this is the second diclofenac periodic paralysis randomized group trial. And then normally what you see, and this is what evidence-based medicine is, more or less the idea of evidence-based medicine is also that you then use this evidence, attack rate a week, that was the primary outcome measure in these patients. So you see the results of 2.4 attacks a week in the placebo group, 1 or 0.3 in the diclofenac group. So you have a treatment effect on average of less than 2.2 attacks a week. So that's quite nice. It's a good result. It's compared to placebo, not compared to another standard treatment. But then you also see this confidence interval, and that means that there's a range between this effect within the group of minus 6.8 attacks a week and almost no reduction. So where are you as an individual patient? We still don't know. Of course, it's great to have these, because with these studies, it got FDA approved. You get some, more experience in the coverage decisions, and so you need them, but it's not the only evidence you need. That's my point. So in Nature, in 2015, this article came up. It's time for one-person trials, especially also with all the electronic measurements that we can do ourselves. Maybe not exactly in this way, but I do believe that it's time for one-person trials. So an N of 1 trial is actually just the crossover trials, like the big randomized controlled trial, but then you just do it in one patient. So you also blind the patient to the treatments. So you add a placebo, or you blind both treatments that you want to compare. And you take visits with objective study measurements at time points. And both the doctor and the patient are not aware of what treatment the patient is getting. And then after this first set of an intervention and placebo, you say, well, I want to make sure that I know the treatment effect at this point. And you can even say, well, I want to have a threshold of evidence. So if you're still unclear whether it's helping, you could include the patient in a second set of treatment. And so you gain power, because of course it's just one patient. So there's a lot of variability, but maybe if you can do 2 or 3 sets, you increase power. And that's the whole idea about N of 1 trials, to get the ultimate treatment effect at the patient level. So of course you can imagine if you're having problems with your appendix, or you need acute surgery, it's kind of difficult to do an N of 1 trial, because you can't get it back in and then get it out again, get it back in and do a placebo surgery. So this is very a good idea for chronic diseases that have relatively stable symptoms that you can measure. And also the drug should not cure the patient, because otherwise in your second treatment set or third, there's already a difference in your baseline. So it should be a symptomatic treatment and a chronic rare disease, such as periodic paralysis or myotonia or muscle cramps, or so there are tons of examples. Of course, limitations, it takes more time than normal treatment. You need some money, logistics, sometimes you need ethical approval, so it's not always easy. Going to skip this. So what we did, so these are individual N of 1 trials. So for example, if someone would be in the audience on acetazolamide, you want to try diclofenac, you could say, well, let's do an individual N of 1 trial with 8 weeks of acetazolamide, 8 weeks of diclofenac, and then look at the results, blind it, and maybe do another set. So that's individual. But can you also have a group evidence from all these little N of 1 trials? Because we want to make sure that everyone in a group trial is also getting results back on the individual basis. So that was the ideal situation for us, and we did in non-dystrophic myotonia, also skeletal muscle channelopathy, we did this group N of 1 trial. Let's see if this video works.
Mag je ogen sluiten, zo hard als je kunt. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 en weer openen.
So this is a young man with a sodium channel mutation causing paramyotonia.
En nog een keer. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 en openen.
And here we
Nog een keer.
You saw the action myotonia of the eyelid muscles. So they suffer from similar problems as patients with periodic paralysis, and mexiletine is the drug that...
1, 2, 3.
Sorry about that. So mexiletine is a sodium channel blocker that was already quite known in the medical literature from cases and case series that it is really helpful to treat these patients. But then in 2007, our group published a Cochrane review. So this is a level of evidence of trying to find out all trials that have been out there. And we found no randomized control level 1 evidence of being effective. So that was actually the starting point of showing that there's no evidence and that we need evidence. But then the Dutch healthcare system used this Cochrane review to say, well, if there's no evidence, then we stop coverage. So we actually were indirectly also causing patients to have a problem with their medication. So now we really should do the trial. So luckily we did it. So the study aim were to show that mexiletine was helping patients to treat myotonia, but also simultaneously look at this design, because probably the design is much more interesting because you want to use this for much more chronic, rare diseases. So we wanted to validate this design as being equally or alternatively powered to give this level 1 evidence that you can, well, also use for decisions on a macroeconomic level. And we're quite lucky that we could cooperate with the group of Rochester and some other groups who participated in the mexiletine trial. So they did this classical group randomized control trial in myotonia. And now we could do the same, but using this new design and to see whether we would come up with extra and new things and whether the results would be compatible. So a patient would go into the trial having his own individual N of 1 trial with 4 weeks of mexiletine or placebo. So randomized, block randomized, and then we would look after 11 weeks, so after this first set, to see whether there was already enough evidence of effectiveness or ineffectiveness. So if it was effective or not effective, you would stop. And if you're still in doubt, you could go up to a maximum of 4 of these treatment sets. So you would say, first get the evidence on a patient level and then group it to get the evidence on a group level. And this is a nice picture that I saw on the internet a couple of days ago about Tiger Woods now and Tiger Woods 10 years ago. And I don't know if you can see it, but now everyone is videotaping how he is doing his swing. So, and I think that's also for us a lesson. We use a lot of outcome measurements, and mostly in trials, well, physicians and scientists use a lot of outcome measures because you're thinking, well, this might be a good idea to also include this, but then again, are you sure you're measuring what you want to measure? So all these people, in my opinion, should just look at the swing because probably it's all on the internet filmed with a proper camera, and the same holds true for all these outcome measures. Be sure to pick the right outcome measure as primary outcome measure. So we used the patient-reported outcome measure, so patients had to score their stiffness and weakness, tiredness and pain on a 0 to 9 scale. 9 being most severe as ever experienced, and 0 being no complaints. But then again, we also did all these other outcome measures. And the method is quite interesting because it's Bayesian statistics, and normally frequentist statistics is about p-values and chance that you could have false positive results and So it's much more about your hypothesis testing, and Bayesian statistic is more about probability. So what's the probability that something would really benefit me? And it's easier to understand because I showed you the p-value and the differences on a group level, but wouldn't you rather have the percentage of that something is helping you? So I have an 80% chance that this is probably helping me. And you can do much better on all different levels. So on patient level, channel level, whole group level, and you get these distributions of the mean in the middle, but also your variation in your own measurement. And you can say, well, I want to make sure that I know the probability of something that's meaningful for me. So it's also a different way of looking at these trials with statistics. And you would say, well, it's kind of difficult. I don't know exactly what you're saying, so please help me. So I will help you. So you see this object flying on this slide. And if I would ask you what kind of object is this, then, well, most of you would say, well, probably it's a bird, but I'm just not sure. You could have also tricked us and that it's some kind of drone looking like a bird, or maybe it's a fly or a plane, or I can't see it because I'm way in the back. So we do this Bayesian thinking all day long. So if you walk outside, you hear a plane, you don't really necessarily have to look because you already know from the sound and from your walking outside and past experiences that it's probably a plane. So if I would ask you all what is it, then probably this would be a distribution of what you would say that it's probably a bird. So some of them would be, of course, still in doubt. So they will be more on the left side, or they will be a bit skeptical. But most of you would be a bit between 80 and 100% surety. So then you get this distribution. So we included 30 patients in this trial, and just to give an example, here on the left you see these are these different scores from 0 to 9, and 9 being really severely affected and 0 no complaint. And the black line is most important because that's the stiffness, and the myotonia is mostly about the stiffness. So this is the placebo 4 weeks period, and that's the mexiletine period. And you see that in this individual patient, almost all scores from daily muscle stiffness will decrease around 2 points, right? From 7 to 5. And you see that also in pain, weakness, tiredness, you see this decrease during the mexiletine period. And then after the trial, we could give patients these kind of figures, saying that there is a 100% chance that there's a meaningful effect on on the stiffness, being the right distribution in black, and 90% for pain, and 99% for weakness, and 99% for tiredness. And of course, it's all about where do you put this meaningful effect threshold, because we said, well, if you're having just below 1 point improvement, but you can also say, well, probably the threshold should be at 2, and then you would say, well, I put the threshold over here, but then still for the stiffness you would have like 99% sure that this would be meaningful for you, but then probably for the pain it wouldn't. So it's not that you really should always be strict about the threshold. You can also use these data just to see where you're at. So it's not so rigid as frequentistic statistics. And on a group level, you can then, all these circles are patients, and in red you see the patient with a chloride mutation, and in green you see the patients with a sodium channel mutation, and here you see the effect. So the patient that I just showed you had that 2-point effect. So interesting is that you can already see something about the heterogeneity in treatment effect, right? It's quite different for all patients. None is the same, or almost none is the same. And you see, if you look at the 2 genes, that the sodium channel patients are doing rather less on the treatment. And you see all these chloride patients, that the top responders that have a treatment effect of improvement of 4 to 6, 7 points are really in the upper right corner. So it gives you an idea about super responders, non-responders, and still at the right side, these squares then represent the group results. So the black is, so the group results is around 3% reduction with this like range of treatment. So you still have these numbers that you present in a normal randomized controlled trial, but you have also this nice picture to see what's the variation between patients, and patients have their own distribution of meaningful effects. So I'll skip this, and this is nice to see, because the whole idea was to see whether we get similar results as a randomized controlled trial. The first one, so the first line is the result from the randomized controlled trial with at the right a 2.69 reduction on this 9-point scale, and we have a 3.12 reduction, and also the spread in this data is quite comparable. So we can say that there's not much heterogeneity within the two studies. So there's quite consistency between the two studies, the randomized controlled trial and our innovative trial design. Interesting is also we included 30 patients, but should you always include 30, or should you check after every patient how many patients you need to get a good group result? So here you see the results, so the probability of having this meaningful effect, and we want it to be somewhere around 95%, so you want to be sure. And you see that after the first 11 patients, actually this black line, and black line represents all patients, and green is the ones with the sodium, and red with the chloride, but you see already after 11 patients that there's not much change on this group level. So maybe for future N-of-1 trials, combined N-of-1 trials, you could also say, let's do interim analysis after each patient, and then maybe decide to stop early if you already have the evidence. On the other hand, all these other patients also benefit from the trial because they have their own individual treatment effect outcomes. So, but it's interesting to show. This treatment, mexiletine, had a quite high gastrointestinal discomfort event rate. So it was kind of funny to also see people coming in. We were blinded, both of us, but if they would say, oh, I feel so much better, I'm not stiff, and I have a bit of diarrhea, then of course it was kind of obvious what was going on. And maybe the comment about outcome measures and taking a lot of outcome measures, it is good. And in this case, we also use a lot of objective outcome measures. And because of the objective outcome measures, for example, EMG, were in line with the patient-reported outcome measures, then you can say, okay, there was deblinding because of the side effects, but still you can see that the objective outcome measures show similar effect. So if you're not having objective outcome measures, that can be a problem. So to conclude this first part, we validated aggregated N-of-1 trial design as alternative level 1 evidence, so probably it's better, faster, cheaper. Of course, this is just an example in one disease. We have it now under revision in one of the major medical journals, so I'm quite hopeful that we get through, and I think that it could have a big impact because we show and we validate it against a randomized controlled trial. So if it gets a lot of exposure, probably more of these trials will be funded. So that will be great, also for periodic paralysis, of course. And for this disease, yeah, we strengthened the evidence, and now it got covered again in the Netherlands, so it also impacted the care in the Netherlands for these patients. So, of course, the discussion is, can we perform these trials also in periodic paralysis? And what outcome measures should we take, and what's the meaningful difference, and what kind of interventions should we use? I would love to hear your opinion about it. Maybe just quickly say something about it, because we are working on it together with Esther. And Ventolin, salbutamol, we already heard, is a treatment that you can use as attack prevention in hyper-PP. You can also use it to win the Tour de France or the Giro, if you like, probably, because Chris Froome had quite high excretion of salbutamol, but then again, he was not really claimed use of EPO because he has asthma, but it's a bit, I'm not sure about it. And but for Esther, we thought let's do an N-of-1 trial together with her with salbutamol and placebo. So we used these 2 placebo inhalers and 2 real ones, and we asked her to keep track of her attacks for what was it, 2-week periods. So we had 4 2-week periods. So we were both blinded, and as you can see here, the number represents the attacks in the 2 weeks. So you can already say there's not a big variance between the periods of placebo and salbutamol. And the red and the blue lines are scales for duration of the attack and the severity of the attack. And also this is quite stable over the periods. And using the Bayesian software again, it's nice to make these distribution pictures. And what we chose here, just as a just an experiment to see how we can use N-of-1 trials in periodic paralysis, we said, well, we think it's meaningful if you have a 20% improvement in attack frequency. But then again, I would love to hear your opinion. Maybe it should be 50% more attack-free days or something, or it should be the intensity or the duration of the attack, or maybe something together in one outcome measure. But not very surprisingly, there was a 4.3% chance that salbutamol in Esther is going to give her a meaningful difference. So obviously we did not, or she's not taking it anymore. But then again, if you don't do an objective N-of-1 trial, you could probably say, well, you can take it for a couple of weeks, 2 or 4 weeks, and then just come back to me and say whether it helps you. But then again, the disease is so variable that it could be very difficult for you all to be sure that it's not the treatment, or maybe it's in a difficult period. And this certainly helps to be really objective as a doctor, but also as a patient. So maybe we can already do the first discussion. It would really help me to now go into questions about this, and maybe also your ideas about N-of-1 trials and what drugs should we take and what do you think is a meaningful difference for our treatment. Is that okay? Okay.
I'm a little surprised about the Ventolin effect, because I use it, and with it I can reduce my attacks from an hour to 10 minutes.
Okay, yeah.
So, and some days I don't need them, but if I exercise or I do something more than the routine, then this is useful, and also the sugar, so it has the same effect.
Yeah, interesting. Well, there is this old trial, or relatively old trial, I think it was from 70s, 80s, and it's a randomized control trial in hyper-PP patients, and on a group level it shows a great effect. So we would also expect from probabilities from the group level that probably Esther would respond to it as well, for at least in a degree. But then again, this probably also nicely shows that this group effect doesn't apply to every patient. So if you would take 10 patients, then probably you would say, well, probably 7 or 8 would respond, but then again, it's also quite normal that someone would just not respond, so, yeah.
But I can see also the difference if I'm alone at home and I have an attack and I'm too late, so the paralysis lasts an hour, and when my husband is home, it lasts 10 minutes.
Yeah. So it's really helpful for you, right? Because an attack
really.
treatment is, of course, also in hyper-PP, preferable over all these preventive treatments. So, yeah.
So did you use this for prevention of attacks, that she would just take it, or just she would take it when she had an attack?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mention, but this was really, we did exactly the same intervention as the randomized controlled trial did before. So at the start of every attack, you use 3 puffs, right? And then after a certain time points again. But it was exactly the same protocol as the randomized controlled trial.
And so I'm apologize that I think I'm missing the N-of-1 idea. Maybe we can talk after. But are you basically saying that there's 2 ways of studying? You can either do 10 patients, 5 of placebo, 5 of study drug, or you can do 10 individual patients and then do like a meta-analysis of your 10.
That's it. Yeah. So you do a crossover trial. So each patient get the actual treatment and a placebo, and then you meta-analyze to get a group level. So it's different. Your first interest is individual patient level, and then you group it.
Okay.
And there's this therapeutic misconception is also interesting because patients going into a randomized controlled trial, if it's a group trial, you get explained that there's a 50% chance that you get the placebo, but still, psychologically, a lot of patients that enter the trial think they're going to benefit anyway. So that there's this, you are probably aware of it, and but still this psychological effect is quite big. And if you go into N-of-1 trials, you know for sure that you get the active treatment, you know for sure that you get the other treatment or the placebo, and you know for sure that you also get this patient level evidence. And of course, if you're only able to do just one set of 2 times 4 weeks, then the power of this evidence at your level is not super high, and it increases if you do more of these sets. But then again, it's better than having nothing, in my opinion. Okay, coming from the internet. Inhaler does not cause an attack, tablets do. So I'm not sure if cause, maybe this is treat an attack and tablets do, that would make more sense to me. But I'm sure this comes back to the same discussion that there's just this big variability in all these treatments. So thank you.
So I think N-of-1 trials, probably a lot of people with periodic paralysis are familiar with them because they've done them on their own.
Yeah.
And now it's just starting to be actually in the medical field. But so if some of us want to try doing these just for our own, to figure out what's up with us, how would we go about doing that? Like contacting our probably not our physician, maybe one of like you or someone else to help kind of set it up? I mean,
yeah. Well, it's a great question because, of course, you have all these degrees of N-of-1 trials. How formal do you want your N-of-1 trial to be? Right. So everyone is doing N-of-1 trials on his own, and the concept of N-of-1 trial in the context of this term N-of-1 trial is actually that you blind and that you do a placebo or alternative treatment. On the other hand, you can also last time I gave a similar talk, and we published this diary on, so an attack diary on the PPA website, and I know that Strongbridge has an app probably to make sure that you have your attacks, so you can do something your own. So it's not too difficult if you take an attack rate weekly to just figure it out. But of course, if you are yourself aware of the treatments you're getting, you have all these psychological effects. So ideally you want to have a physician involved and a pharmacist who can make this study medication.
Okay. Thanks.
But then again, I would also just be really enthusiastic of getting more of these informal trials. So just the trials that you're probably doing now. If we can group this evidence in a way, it would be really good. Yeah.
I'm sure people have been doing that for years.
Yeah.
My question is about the Ventolin. How can you make it a placebo when you cough when you take it and it has a taste, its own taste?
So they can just leave the active component out and still have all the other components in it. And I'm not sure, Esther, did you notice any difference in taste or how it worked? Or
and did you cough? Did you cough? What? I didn't cough from it. Yeah.
Maybe it's different because she's not an asthma patient.
Yeah. Well, and I also just know, I do not know what I have, so I'm not there. But when I accidentally was put on salbutamol for asthma, in terms of the working on my legs, it was the difference between night and day. It was like being on a rusty bicycle and like being on a well-oiled bicycle. It was
so you improved
completely, dramatically. And physiotherapists said it too. They were really surprised. So no, but I immediately add, I do not know what I have, but I know whatever it was, salbutamol did work. But it was kind of it wasn't on a basis. It was 2 puffs 4 times a day, and the preventer had nothing to do with it. And it was subsequently proved I did not have asthma.
Yeah. So it could be a clue in your diagnosis.
I'm just saying. But I do not know what I have. I want to say that again. Okay. Yeah, who's next?
Do they have like a CBD inhaler? That would be
marketing. So I wanted to make a comment on the outcome measure to be used because I think that's definitely a difficult question because there's so much heterogeneity, so much difference across patients with periodic paralysis. So definitely I would recommend some kind of aggregate measure, including severity of attack, time of attack, or length of attack, frequency of attack. But I think also quality of life
for sure.
survey would be very, very important. And then maybe, I don't know if there is one specifically for periodic paralysis yet, but developing one, because there's so much difference across muscular disorders as well.
No, sure, you're right. So there is this INQUAL, and there are other questionnaires that are quite well for neuromuscular diseases, have also been validated in channelopathies. So I totally agree that you probably need all these measurements, but of course you want to make sure to also identify one outcome measure. And it could also be, and it would be an interesting idea, to have a group N of 1 trial with every patient in it having his own primary outcome measure. Makes it more difficult to group, but would be a nice concept to say on the different individual primary outcome measures, this is the group outcome measure. And then do not group as a group level all the attack frequency, but for the one it's attack frequency, the other severity. I think if you be sure to determine it before you start the trial and also publish already the protocol, then probably you can get away with it. But if you don't publish it before, or don't determine it closely, then of course people will say, yeah, you just pick your own outcome measure that's quite helpful and then meta-analysis. So
I think the concept of a quality of life, you know, that's heavily emphasized by the FDA as being like positive things. I always found it, certainly in dermatology, like someone's, you know, has eczema and they're itchy. So like there's a rash, there's itch, you know, and then they have quality of life. But you think like, well, if the rash goes away, then that correlates, the quality of life will get better. And if the itch goes away, the quality of life will get better. So you may as well just measure the rash and the itch. But with periodic paralysis, there's so many subtle things about like kind of fatigue over periods of time, kind of a long-term weakness, but you can't quite quantify it as an attack, you know, so that if you take a medicine and you have a better sense of quality of life, in this case, I think in our case where it's a little harder to characterize any one thing, that might actually really be something useful. As I don't know, we have like 20, 25 minutes-ish. Just, I don't know how many more questions we can do.
It's just a quick question, but a plea from the second-class citizen again. Would you consider N of 1 trials in people who've been clinically diagnosed but their genetic mutation's not yet been found? Because if you could do that with the N of 1s, which would benefit the patient, then that could be then another diagnostic pillar for that patient.
No, for sure. I guess probably now with the heterogeneity you can go both ways. So you can really look at a pure phenotype probably by, or pure as it gets, by including patients with similar mutations, for example 5 with a similar mutation, but you can also say, I want to make sure how heterogeneous the group of non-genetically defined patient is. And let's say that this group accidentally would respond similar to the treatment with a very similar treatment effect. There would be another argument to say, okay, this is a pure periodic paralysis subgroup. So I'm sure that also N of 1 trials can help in a diagnostic way. Is that what you're meaning, probably, right? Yeah.
I guess should we move on to the next segment?
Yeah.
And we have lunch. We have lunch today at 12:15. Just plan on having a free lunch.
And we're closing down at 12.
And we're closing down at.
We'll have to close the room down.
We'll close the room down at 12. So we have like a half hour. All right.
So quickly acknowledge all the people who worked with me, and I probably showed it also 3 years ago, but I really like this image, this video clip of one of the patients who was in the Maxilitine trial and had severe myotonia, so also weakness, could never run stairs, and now his daughter and he were really enjoying that he could now really run through the corridor. So I think this is really what the meaningful difference is right here, right? So just as a quick feedback on the discussion we had on Friday, so are there recent diagnostic supportive criteria? The latest review, and Steve, you're on it, right? Yeah, you're one of the last senior authors. This is a nice extensive review of diagnosis and treatment of periodic paralysis. You can just find it on the internet, it's freely available. And in the text there are these supportive criteria for periodic paralysis. And I think the term is right because there are supportive criteria. So for hypo-PP, if we just quickly go through them, 2 or more attacks of muscle weakness with documented shift. Now, of course, we already had discussion about where should the shift be. So this is open for improvement probably. So you can have these 2 documented attacks or 1 attack, but also a documented attack in a relative. If not, you have these extra supportive criteria, 6-1, so onset in first, second decade, your attack duration, positive triggers, improvement with potassium, positive family history, positive long exercise test. You could also say, well, maybe if I find vascular myopathy changes in muscle biopsy, this could maybe also be supportive. And then you also have some criteria that should not be present, right? So you should not have other causes of hypokalemia, so no shift, but just a shortage of potassium or myotonia present. So these are quite helpful. They are not 100% useful in all cases, but still it's good to have some kind of sense of expert opinion. And for hyper-PP it's more or less the same, but then of course you have these attacks with different thresholds. You have other triggers. You can have the myotonia, and it's actually a supportive trigger in the hyper-PP if you find it. And of course also this exclusion of other causes. And for Anderson-Tawil syndrome, it's presence of 2 of the following 3. So periodic paralysis, symptomatic cardiac arrhythmias on EKG, and or the prolonged QT or QUC interval, and then the characteristic facial and dental anomalies. And then they say on B, 1 of the above 3 in addition to at least 1 other family member who meets 2. Well, and this is of course also probably, you also have de novo cases, right? So this is also something that could help you, but if it's a de novo new mutation occurring in you as a first patient, then of course you don't have the have to have someone else in your family who has the disease. Are there any questions on this, or? So it's freely available if you check on review and periodic paralysis. You probably on Google find it in the first 10 hits. So I've been talking a lot and you've been sleeping in the dark and trying to maintain focus. So what I want to do now is change it. So I go sleep and sit in the dark and you go puzzling this case and probably hopefully make the right diagnosis. So I show you a video clip in 2 slides, but first give you some clinical information because you are all the doctor, so please diagnose this patient with all your knowledge. It's a 31-year-old man with already quite a remarkable medical history, quite complex. So he had this benign, or at least to a degree benign, brain tumor when he was a child, a craniopharyngioma, and it was treated with resection, so removal of the tumor, but also radiotherapy. And because of the location of this tumor being in your hypothalamus and pituitary, these are really difficult to pronounce in English. This is crucial for your hormonal balance. So most often patients need all kinds of hormonal suppletion for the rest of their life. Then he also had quite coincidentally epileptic seizures from a meningioma, so another brain tumor, could be maybe causative because of radiotherapy. So he had also a resection of that, so second resection. And then in 2014 as well, he also developed a thyroid carcinoma. But that's not why he came in at the emergency department. And he had all kinds of medication from this to maintain the correct hormonal balance. And the anti-epileptic treatment, levetiracetam. And interestingly, the growth hormone suppletion was just recently stopped. So that was the only real change in medication before he came to us. So in August 2015, he came in saying that already for a couple of months he had this weekly episodic complaints of muscle weakness in his legs more than the arms, usually early in the morning. So around once a week. Duration of the weakness was between 1 and 3 hours, and this was the first time that he could not stand without assistance. So that was the reason to come now and not before, but before he was able to walk around. He already told me, well, probably levetiracetam is causing this symptom. He had no clear triggers, no muscle pain or cramps, no problems of sensory function, and no positive family history. And this is the small video clip of him on admission the day after this big attack.
Mag ik wel staan?
Dat gaat, hè? Ja. Iets verder
Een
naar
paar passen lopen.
Dat hoefde niet gisteren te proberen.
Nee.
So we ask him to walk around just to get a sense of, is he able to walk unassisted? Are there still muscles that are weak?
Ja. Kunt u op de tenen lopen?
So he's still quite able to walk on his toes.
En op de hakken.
Walk on the heels. But you see that he's a bit walking like this with his knees stiff.
Zo dus met de
Most often this is a sign of the proximal muscles, so the quadriceps being more weak.
Ja. En de andere kant?
Nou, dan zag ik hem door DM.
Ja.
So then a good test, because you might say, well, it's quite okay, he's able to walk unassisted, but then if you are really trying to get someone up, and this normally should be, well, easily able to do 10 times if you're at this age without any joint problems, but then you see he's already suffering doing 1, so he really has his proximal weakness still day after this attack. So my questions to you are, what kind of examination would you do, in what order, what are your thoughts? So I was hoping that you could take over for me so I can have a quick break from all these efforts that I already did. So who's going to help the audience with some first thoughts? No pressure here, but... So I give you the microphone? Or are you going
They ask you to do it one time, but we didn't know either. But afterwards, when you pay attention to your own triggers, then you know that it's the repetition of things that cause the problem, not the one time.
Okay, so that's really good. Already what you're saying, so probably you would suggest to go back to him and explain, well, probably at first you don't think there are classical triggers, but can we go through it again, right? So I will help you a bit, because during this worst attack, he was at this museum walking outside. It was temperature was high, he was sweating a lot, so there is maybe a trigger with, and he was walking around more than he was used to. So does this already ring any bell, or is anyone else thinking about, like? But maybe Gabe, just a quick first question. Do you think this is a genetic periodic paralysis or not, just based on the story?
Seems like there's a lot of other stuff.
That's maybe the first biggest observation, right? He already has such a complex history. So,
right.
Yeah. So this means you would have it like a high probability of being genetic cause, or high probability of being a secondary cause caused by something else.
Probably a secondary cause. Yeah. Because there's no family history, no.
Yeah. So we get you into med school with this kind of remarks. Yeah. Okay, so another good question here was the thyroid was removed, and normally we want to know thyroid function, right? And especially that it's not way too high. A thyrotoxicosis, like a toxic presence of thyroid hormone. So
that could be the case, of course, if the supplement went wrong. He has way too high supplements, and that's why we would test, of course, the thyroid hormone function. So you would probably suggest to do so, right? Okay, so it was normal, but great. And while we're at it, you're doing laboratory work. Would you also try to do something else? So what's on your list that you would like to have? So we want the thyroid hormones, something else? We're doing the lab work now.
Well, his kidneys, because he was sweating.
Kidneys, kidney function. CK, why not?
Potassium, strangely enough.
Potassium, something else?
Thinking thyrotoxic PP, but
You were thinking thyrotoxic PP, yeah?
Yeah.
He's
So
maybe taking too much replacement hormone?
Yeah, so we'd probably also do sodium, magnesium, calcium, why not? Provoke a new attack, that would be... of course, and maybe then I already give you this slide, because you want to see whether this threshold is there, right? Whether it's a movement of potassium going into the cell and then a reversal of the shift, or it's really a low potassium. So his potassium was low, 2.6, 2.7 during the attack, and then I don't have it here, but then after, say, the next day and a couple of hours later, it was normalized back to around 3.5, 4. So actually what we have here is a documented shift. So, because we said there is a differential diagnosis between primary genetic periodic paralysis and maybe secondary, but you also have the differential diagnosis between a shift, like a problem of membrane excitability, or just low potassium by a renal cause. I could also give you away that renal function is normal, and also more or less all the other measurements that we took. CK was normal. There's this small increasement in the liver enzymes, but sometimes this can also be caused by the muscle damage. So there was not. It's especially the potassium shift that we see from the lab work.
And clearly, this is barium poisoning, right? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. No, that's not. So okay, so we already had documented the shift, so we don't need to provoke another attack. So what can we do to make sure that we're on the right track? Anything else? Yeah.
He's exercising as well. Like you said, he was sweating too. That's a trigger for me.
Yeah.
Whether he was stressed out or not during the day, whether he was tired, it's a perfect storm of normal triggers.
Yeah. Great, I like it, because you should never be satisfied with what you heard first time. So go back to the patient, ask again for triggers, maybe ask a fourth time, fifth time. So if you go back again and ask about the diet and the stress level, probably wasn't that different from normal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you.
So Jake, what about you? What are your thoughts on the case?
This is a good question. I mean, I like the fact that there's a low potassium that's corrected. How many things really do that other than hypokalemic periodic paralysis? There's not a whole lot. Because, you know, if you had diuretic abuse, or if you had some kind of, perturbation in aldosterone, too much aldosterone, you hold sodium, you pee potassium. He had the craniopharyngioma thing.
Yeah.
I mean, you could check cortisol, those kinds of things. But, I would like to do a CMAP. I think that would be my next test.
Well, great, because some of the thoughts we obviously also had. He has all these hormonal disbalances and supplements. So the endocrinologist also checked for cortisol, aldosterone levels, all kinds of hormones in urine, and it's quite complicated, but it stretches that you really should cooperate. Hyperinsulin type 2 diabetes is a suggestion on the internet. Yeah, well, so the glucose was a bit increased. You can check for it, but I'm not sure if it's really up high in your differential diagnosis. So we did some other tests to make sure that we're not dealing with a renal or hormonal problem, and then went for the long exercise test. Because at this point, you still want to make sure, is this a problem of membrane excitability or not, right? And here again, you see this quite known already figure for long exercise tests. So we see the CMAP reference placed at 100% at rest. Then we do the 5 minutes of exercise of the little ring finger muscle, and then we look at how the CMAP amplitude is behaving in the 50 minutes after exercise. And between the yellow lines is the normal value area, and of course this is also open for debate, where should you put these lines, and but then again you can quite convincingly see that there is this slowly progressive degrees over 50 minutes dropping below the threshold of being a positive negative test. So this is evidence, or at least it helps you in your thinking that this is a periodic paralysis. Not the cause, but it is probably caused by these ion channel dysfunction in a way. Okay. So let me give this away, because what Gabe was also mentioning, a great comment is, of course, complex medical history already with all kinds of problems that can cause similar disorders, or at least you can think about it. But then again, this is a rare field, rare things happen, so we thought this can be a double hit, so that he has a mutation, but it is probably not too severe, and that all kinds of hormonal and other changes are bringing him to get attacks right now. So we did the genetics of the 3 known genes, and we're also quite lucky to have this whole exome sequencing opportunity. So if we're not sure, we can screen for all known neuromuscular disease genes, and we can even say we do open genome, open exome, I should say, open exome sequencing to also check for all new variations. But negative, so no new mutation found. So to bring this supportive criteria of hypo-PP, is it helpful or not? So he had a shift of potassium during the attack. It was low. So it was around, what was it, 2.6, I guess, right? So, and he had, well, more afterwards, more documented attacks. So criteria 1 we have, criteria 2 we don't have, because his family history was negative. No one else had similar complaints. If you look at these other, on criteria 3, other 6 laboratory features, supportive features, his onset was not in the first or second decade, because it was in his 30s. Attack duration more than 2 hours, yes. Positive triggers, not sure. Improvement with potassium intake, that's what I not mentioned, but we provided, of course, potassium and Diamox, which helped him. So yes, positive family history, no. Positive McManus long exercise test, yes. Exclusion of other causes, we're not sure. We've done all the lab work, we asked the endocrinologist, but still you think, could there be something that we're missing? No myotonia. So the criteria help in your thinking.
Did his mother have, or father have just weakness without attacks?
No, nothing. So
no
really
myopathies?
No complaints at all in neurological area. No muscle weakness, nothing. So maybe just to make sure that everyone gets a diagnosis, who would say this is secondary periodic paralysis caused by a cause that we are still not aware of? Raise your hands, please. Self-correct, yeah. So at this first weakness attack, because it was not that severe and we wanted to know how it would behave, it's self-corrected. Yeah, that's a great question, yeah. Okay, so I see some hands of the physicians, but I'm thinking maybe it's a bit difficult for most of the audience. Who thinks this is something really different? We are way out of track of getting a good diagnosis.
You didn't ask if it's just primary.
Who thinks it's still primary with an unknown cause of disease?
Absolutely.
Probably. it's certainly in the criteria of conversion disorder. The first criteria is the patient a woman, and then you get supportive. So does the male act like a woman, and that's a supportive criteria. So let me get back to the question. But actually, I ask you to diagnose it. So it's still the opposite way, right? I want you, Jake, to come here and say, no, it's this, and we're sure, and okay, let's...
Listen, I'm a dermatologist.
Okay.
I'm just a dermatologist.
So what we did was we treated the attacks, right? That's number one. So this is all interesting for us physicians, also for the patient, because it has quite important implications. But at the time point, he just wanted to be without attacks, right? And wanted to know what was going on. So that worked quite well with Diamox and oral potassium, and then we instructed him when the attacks were more severe, he could use the KCL drink 3 times 60 milliliters at home. But if then he would go into a further attack, especially within this diagnostic insecurity, we would like him to come in to the hospital to have IV, or at least to be seen by a neurologist or someone from internal medicine. So that happened 2 or 3 times in a couple of months. So we're still unaware, right? And then we have again this pyramid of hierarchical evidence, of evidence-based medicine, with the randomized controls up there and the case reports and animal studies more below. And then you're thinking, is this really also the hierarchical pyramid for evidence-based for rare diseases? Because I think cases and reporting of interesting cases can be really helpful, especially when you're dealing with another patient somewhere else in another country. You might have the similar symptoms as someone from a different continent. Could really help speed up your diagnostic process. So we also checked PubMed. Steve already showed this reporting of channelopathies in this database of scientific literature. So we go back to PubMed and we check for hormonal changes of patients who had, for example, I think this patient also had, let me quickly read it again. I'm sorry about that. I think he was also a patient who had a brain tumor and then deficiencies and was started on suppletion. And there is a case from Sanzone and Meola from Milan, great friends in the periodic paralysis field, describing a patient who gets hypokalemic periodic paralysis during growth hormone deficiency and in the course of supplementing with growth hormone. And remember that in this patient, the only change in treatment was that he stopped growth hormone. On the other way, the patient came in and said, I think it's levetiracetam, it's my anti-epileptic treatment. It was started 2 years before, but still he thought it is the anti-epileptic treatment that is giving these attacks. So we thought, well, also just check for interesting cases. Is this an observation that others made? And there are some cases of levetiracetam, the anti-epileptic treatment, giving chronic hypokalemia. So not really episodic attacks, but chronic hypokalemia. So interesting. So what we did, we restarted, or the endocrinologist restarted growth hormone, just to see as a first step change, could this be the cause, and could we, and actually this is an informal N-of-1 trial, right? We could have done blinding the growth hormone and check for attack rate, and then we would have been in a situation to have really objective measurements. But then again, you don't want someone with invalidating attacks to also go through a placebo period, right? So should really weigh when is the time to do a formal N-of-1 trial and when you go just treat like you normally do. No effect. So then we're quite puzzled because levetiracetam gives chronic hypokalemia, but he doesn't have chronic hypokalemia. It's weakness, attacks with drop of potassium, episodic. And of course, if you stop treatment, you have to switch to another anti-epileptic. There's this chance of getting new seizures. He had quite big seizures. So we also discussed this with a neurosurgeon who was seeing him for the follow-up on the brain tumor that is causing the epilepsy. And he said, well, his last seizure was already 2 to 3 years ago. So it's quite reasonable to just stop it for a period of time and see what happens. So we stopped it. What do you think? No attack at all. So till today, he has no attack anymore. And He had still attacks, small attacks in the week before stopping the treatment. So it seems like levetiracetam in this case was really, well, at least pushing the system to these. I'm not saying that it's the only cause. Maybe it's his whole complex biology, but it was the piece of the puzzle to remove to get him off the treatments.
Perhaps Shelley is giving me a time.
This is the last slide.
Oh, okay.
So lessons learned, listen to the patient, because this is the second time that we probably had to listen better. I think here we did listen to him, and of course there were other circumstances why we tried other things first, but it still keeps getting back that the patient probably knows more about causes than we think as physician. So it also shows that it's such an important field to cooperate with other specialities, with the patient. His father had drawn for me these graphs of all his attacks, and he would send me by email and with the duration and severity. So I had all these data of him that could really could make this case. And I think the importance of getting this shift is also recognized here, and importance of case reports that could really change your diagnostic procedure. And levetiracetam and growth hormone, and that's probably something to remember for us, that it can give these secondary hypo-PP attacks. And maybe it's the combination of the both in this case, I'm not sure, but it is interesting, and we're trying to write it down as a case report so that others can also learn from these experiences when they encounter a similar patient with similar complaints.
Steve is going to do that in the mice, though, right? Yes. Put it in the bath.
Yeah, just do levetiracetam and see what happens. Okay, should we stop here, or should I show a small video just for 1 moment?
Can you do a one moment video, Shelley? We got till 12:15. We can do it just for.
Film zetten. Ja.
I think it's about 1 minute.
Zou je voor mij eens het hoofd kunnen oprichten van de bank, onderzoeksbank?
So he's asking in Dutch to lift his hand from the bed. So this was a male around 55 who came in with flaccid weakness, history of myotonia, never been formally diagnosed, so he's really struggling with muscle strength.
Proberen de vingers te spreiden. Is dat ook verstijfd voor het gevoel? Of is dat meer dat hij geen kracht heeft? Meer geen kracht.
Asking, is it stiffness or
weakness? Saying it's weakness. Tegen te houden.
This is a colleague from Amsterdam, Dr. Kerklaan.
Knijpen met de vingers.
It's quite rare to have a video of someone who's in a bad shape. We have your video, but we thought it's good to have this video published as well.
Kijk even naar de been. Is het goed dat de knaak even opzij doet? Kunt u proberen het linkerbeen op te tillen. Het rechterbeen kunt u optillen.
So he's testing all these muscle groups, and you see, well,
we have this
scale of 0 to 5, and if you cannot move your muscle against gravity is below 3. So what you see here is around 2 to 3 on this 5 scale.
Is dit gevoel ongeveer hetzelfde als dit gevoel?
Sensory testing, sometimes it's a nerve problem, inflammatory nerve problem that could cause this, so it's also testing sensory function.
Staat hij stil? Zou ik wel willen vragen, zou u voor mij de ogen heel sterk dicht willen knijpen? En als ik ja zeg, al 5 seconden in 1 keer de ogen weer open willen doen.
So here's looking at action myotonia.
3, 2, 1, 0.
Well, you see that he has the stiffness of the upper eyelid, right, or the eyelid muscles. And he had a hypo-PP attack, so his potassium was really low, it was around 2. And remember from Steve's slide yesterday that you have this overlap between myotonia and weakness, almost always in hyper-PP. Right?
Is het nu weer normaal voor uw gevoel?
So this again example of how rare this field is, and there are so many examples of patients who do not fit the common ideas about periodic paralysis.
Is het nu slechter dan anders voor je gevoel? Is dat hetzelfde als altijd?
That's just what I wanted to mention. So it's good to have such a video, and it's good to again realize that there are so many examples who do not fit the common periodic paralysis patient.
Absolutely.
So thank you for the attention.
That's what a wonderful way to end the conference. That really kind of put together a lot of principles that we were discussing, and you know, it's a little almost kind of traumatic. I mean, all of us, many of us in the room, actually are that guy at some point. We're not. So you know, it's just a reminder that. Anyway, Shelley wanted to you know, say goodbye and stuff. But this is sadly going to conclude our first Ireland conference, and I think it was really great. I think that we got to meet a lot of people that otherwise maybe couldn't make it to the States. That was the point of this, and you know, I hope everyone got to make some strong bonds and friendships and learn from each other. And you know, Shelley gets the last word.
And that's the way it should be. Yeah, I didn't have to have the last word. First, I apologize for having to rush speakers. It's what I do, so sorry about that. Oh, it's just I'll keep it in time. They moved our lunch time up today to 12:15. It was supposed to be 12:30 because they have a buffet or they have something, a brunch going on. So please keep your name badges, and that will get you in for a free lunch. Thank you to all the speakers who have come. Learn something every time. You guys are amazing, and ladies, and you did a very good job. Thank you. Uva, where's Uva? Dude with the camera. Thank you. I used to take the pictures. He is fabulous. So he gives the pictures to Eric, and then Eric will put them all online. So thank you. You're the best. I love seeing all the sharing. Everyone that has found someone like them, or talking to everybody, trying to learn everything that you can. And I really hope that you guys did learn something from this. What I'm hoping is that you'll let us know how you're doing. A lot of times people leave the conference and we don't know if they're getting better. Usually they get better, and that's why they don't come back. We're like one big happy family, and I've just met a whole lot of new cousins today, over the weekend. So please go to our Facebook page, PPA, and let us know how you're doing. Let us know what you learned. Let us know anything, and then we can start some real conversations there, and you'll be in touch with all of us that way. So that would be wonderful. What surprised me a lot this time is I think this is the biggest amount of ATS people we've had at a conference, the largest amount of hypers. It is normally dominated by hypos, almost always, and that has been really great to see more people being able to find someone like themselves, because in the past it's a little bit of a struggle. So we've had a great variety of people here. And apparently I need notes. I think that's about it, but I live for these. We absolutely love these, and I hope you guys all had a good time too. Thank you. Strongbridge was kind enough to send the posters and the hats and everything to us, but we can't get them home. They're just going to be thrown away. If anybody wants to take a poster home, can take it, anything.
We didn't get to that last night. We need to purchase them.
The hats? He's got the hats. I will take your money. He's got the hats.
I want the check. I want the check.
You want the check? Oh, I better.
Keep your badge on for lunch. So listen. The question is, is there a role for sustained release potassium, or should you just drink the many people use the if you have an attack, drink the liquid. If you're preventing for the next day, take the pills. You can experiment. It's experiment. You have to decide.
I was wondering, these tablets, in order to get them from a pharmacy, it says doctor should prescribe.
I can't. Just email me what you need.
Yes.
And send me the photo, whatever, and I can prescribe it. What do I do? You want me to just prescribe it? So I prescribe it for Akis's name, and then it goes to, I pick it up and send it to you. You have friends? Do you have a family or friend that can?
I have some friends, but I also email from Carlos.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if I have the prescription, you could scan it and maybe.
Yeah.
I would ask them if they will send it. No, a friend of mine will take it from there and send
Yeah,
it.
that's fine.
Yes.
I'm happy to do. Just write me an email. Anything in an email, I'll make it work.
Prescription.
Yes.
Okay.
That's easy.
And do you think I should also give magnesium to baby?
Listen, you can try. Some people it will get better. Some people it will get worse. I don't know. I don't think so. Oh, wait, listen, it's only dangerous if it makes him worse. So the thing is, like, first start him on acetazolamide. Let him be protected a little bit, and then we can start screwing with other things. Because if he's completely naked without therapy, and you give him something that makes him worse, he's gonna maybe go to the 1.5 again. I don't want that to happen. Also, if he's just a little weak and you're pretty sure that it was exercise induced and not a diet induced, that's when you can play with magnesium. But if you think it's a strong attack, I would be careful about. Yeah, you're welcome. No, it's nice to see you. Okay, of course, we'll stay in touch. Yeah. Okay.